The purpose of the online lecture is for you to become familiar with our next philosopher, Socrates, and some of his key ideas, as background for our next seminar reading. During this lecture, you will have a few journal entries, so keep some paper and a pen handy. Write the entries now and bring them into our next class. Turn them in with your journal. I also recommend printing out the PowerPoint from Blackboard and taking notes into it. You will be responsible for the information on quizzes and on the final written exam. This process will probably take about 40 minutes, maybe an hour if you give the journal serious thought and do the extra credit. When you're finished with the lecture, take the second review quiz in the Blackboard module entitled Introducing Socrates Review Quiz. So here's your first journal entry. Write about a time when you had to decide between doing what was beneficial or easy or desirable and doing what was right. It could be something simple like deciding whether to eat a bag of chips versus an apple, or whether to go 50 miles per hour in a 35-mile-an-hour zone when you're late for class, or whether to study or watch TV or play video games. Or it could be something more complex, serious and challenging, such as deciding whether to help a friend cheat on an assignment or test, or whether to report misconduct by a teammate or a coworker at your job, or whether to tell the truth when doing so could get you in trouble. It may even be a decision that affects the course of your life. Describe the situation in detail in your journal entry, then explain the reasons or arguments on both sides of the question. You don't have to write about the outcome unless you want to. Take a few minutes to work on this and pause the podcast if needed before moving on to the next slide. Most moral or ethical decisions come down to a choice between doing what is beneficial, easy, or appealing, and doing what is right, based on principles or values that you hold. The beneficial or desirable choice usually appears obvious. In the case of whether to speed or not, getting to class on time is beneficial, but not getting a ticket is also beneficial. So there are arguments from benefits on both sides of this question. On the other hand, there is the principle of obeying the law, as well as protecting the safety of pedestrians and other drivers. In the case of whether to help a friend cheat, the beneficial might be to keep the friendship. In the case of whether to tell the truth, it might be more convenient to tell that little white lie than to deal with the messy consequences of telling the truth. And no one's getting hurt, right? But the principle of honesty tells you something different. Desires and emotions can also come into play. The bag of chips may taste better than the apple, and watching your favorite show or playing a video game is of course way more fun than studying. More serious, challenging, and even professional cases, the beneficial may take a more complex form. You might find yourself having to choose between doing a task quickly and easily and doing it right, or between loyalty to a person and the good of the company or organization that you work for. Your company may have to choose between making a profit and protecting the environment or worker safety, or employing American workers instead of outsourcing for cheaper labor. When you are a leader, you will find yourself constantly making such choices, so you need to develop the habit now of reflecting on your situation, identifying your principles, as well as your emotions and desires, and making a choice based on strong moral reasoning skills. Socrates, as we will see, was faced with such a choice in the reading we will do for seminar, and went through such a process of reflection in conversation with a friend. Socrates could be described as a blue-collar family man who became a self-professed gadfly in the ancient city of Athens, Greece. His father was a construction worker, and his mother was a midwife, a kind of nurse who helps to deliver babies. Socrates himself served in the Athenian army during the Peloponnesian Wars between the cities of Athens and Sparta, and he was legendary for his toughness, Stories circulated that he would march barefoot in the snow or stand for hours just thinking. He got married and had a family, but we meet him in his later days as a senior citizen in Athens, kind of like a homeless veteran, wandering around the community and talking to people. He was not a physically attractive person, but people, especially young people, fell in love with what he had to say because he challenged authority, and he came to be considered a wise teacher, although I don't think he ever called himself that. He considered himself a gadfly, an insect that bites horses. He thought his calling was to irritate his community, Athens, into changing for the better. Kind of like Ron Kovic in Born on the 4th of July, a Vietnam vet who becomes a leader in the peace movement. One of my past students, Nicole Gill, once said of Socrates, he died trying to teach his students how to think. The date of his death is, to the best of historians' knowledge, 399 BC. I will not ask you to memorize many dates for this course, but do remember this one as a reference point for the story of philosophy. To get our bearings geographically, we're still in the Mediterranean world, the lands about the Mediterranean Sea. The name literally means in the middle of the world, at the conjunction of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Critics sometimes comment that philosophy is about dead white men. Socrates was, like Thales, Eratosthenes, and Pythagoras, an ancient Mediterranean person, not a Northern European, so we don't need to think of him as white. Here's a closer look at the Mediterranean Sea and the countries around it. Socrates lived in Greece, the peninsula between Italy and Turkey. At the time, Greece was not a unified country with borders, but rather a collection of city-states, polis in Greek. Athens was one of these. In some ways, ancient Greece reminds me of northwest Indiana, a bunch of cities and towns coexisting in the same region, but each with its own government and local culture, and sometimes with rivalries. The way Socrates talks about Thessaly and our reading reminds me of the way Hammond and Munster people talk about each other, except that now we act out those rivalries in sports rather than in wars. The way Socrates often engaged in conversation with people is sometimes called the Socratic method. Your next task is something we would normally do in class and have a bit of fun with. Think of a situation, hypothetical or real, in which two people have a conflict. Now imagine those two people having a discussion, in which one of the people only asks questions, but in such a way as to get the other person to agree with him or her. Normally we role-play this in class with me and a student, making it up on the spot, but here is one possible example. A student comes to me to complain about getting a 0 on an online assignment that had a deadline. The student says, "Why did you give me a 0 on the Blackboard post?" The teacher asks, "What is the syllabus deadline?" The student says, "I know, but our internet crashed on that day and I did not have time to do the assignment." The teacher asks, "Why did you wait until the last minute to do it?" The student responds, "I should have managed my time better, but can't I make it up just this once?" The teacher responds, "If I allow you to make it up, will that be fair to the other students who already took 0s for missed assignments?" The student admits, "I guess not." The teacher then says, "We'll do the next one well in advance of the deadline. You can earn extra credit if you do the posts on 3 separate days." In this case, the teacher used questions instead of statements to coax the student into seeing the teacher's point of view. Now, I'm sure that you could have come up with much better responses on the part of the student. The questions appeal to an inherent sense of fairness that the teacher assumes the student shares, based on principles of keeping agreements, namely the syllabus, and treating everyone equally. Socrates often did something similar. He and his friend, his student Plato, believed that every human being, deep down, knows what is right and good and true and fair. We are born with this knowledge. It is, to use a Latin phrase, a priori, which means from before. The soul possesses this a priori knowledge even before we are born. It is part of what today we would call the conscience. For Socrates, his convictions about knowledge were tied up with his idea that the soul is immortal and experiences the divine realm of ideas, kind of like heaven, before it is born or incarnated, and that the soul is born and dies multiple times in a process of reincarnation through different bodies and lives. Learning, therefore, is a kind of recalling or remembering truths that our souls once clearly saw. Teaching, therefore, is not a process of telling people stuff, but a process of asking them questions that will help them to elicit or draw out the truth that is already within them. In class, this would be your task, to pair up with each other and to come up with an everyday scenario in which two people have a disagreement, and one person uses questioning to bring the other person around to his or her point of view. And then write down the Socratic dialogue in your journals. Since we are not together, write your own Socratic dialogue on your own as your second journal entry. If you wish for extra points, however, do it on the spot with a friend or roommate and video record it and send me the video. But also write it down as a journal entry, even if you choose the video option. Pause and take the time needed to do this now. Socrates explains this style of conversation when he speaks in his own defense at his trial. Plato wrote about this speech in his dialogue, The Apology. Socrates tells his own backstory. Once, he says, a friend of his visited the oracle at Delphi. The oracle was a kind of priestess or shaman who, the Greeks believed, could be possessed or inspired by the god Apollo, and would then speak prophecies, kind of like Professor Trelawney if you've seen or read Harry Potter. The architectural remains of this shrine or holy place still stand in Greece. So the story is that this friend went to the oracle, bringing an offering to the god, of course, and asked, "Who is the wisest person in the world?" And the oracle got all inspired, and perhaps went into a trance, and answered in a mysterious voice, "Socrates." So, the friend goes back to see Socrates in Athens and tells him, "The oracle said you're the wisest person in the world." Well, Socrates doesn't just say, "Wow, okay, that's cool." No, he questions God. He thinks, that can't be right. So, he sets about testing the oracle's claim by looking for people who are wiser than himself in order to prove the god wrong. So, he went around Athens questioning respected people, politicians, poets, the entertainers of the ancient world, wealthy upper-class noble people or businessmen. In a sense, he saw himself as on a mission from God. But he found all these people to be ignorant. So instead of finding wise people, he ended up exposing the ignorance of respected people in society, and this is eventually what got him in trouble. Through this process of questioning others, Socrates says, he drew the conclusion that he was wise because he was aware of his ignorance. Others, he said, think that they know something, but they really don't. Well, me? I know that my knowledge is worth nothing. I do not think that I know what I do not know. Through the process of public conversation, Socrates attracted young people who do like seeing their elders get shown up as fools. He also gave birth, as we discussed, to the so-called Socratic method, a form of teaching through questioning. In colleges, this term is sometimes used to describe a tactic of rhetorical questioning in which an instructor will ask a class comprehension questions to which the instructor knows that answer, expecting students to raise their hands and dutifully give the right answer. In my view, personally, as a teacher, that is patronizing and a waste of students' time, as well as an insult to your intelligence. It is not what Socrates was about. He was interested in prompting people to think and to question their own assumptions in order to get at some important truth, a truth that he would discover along with them. He would especially probe a person's understanding of terms they used and took for granted, such as virtue, happiness, or justice. Or today we might even say, being a nice person. Well, what does that mean? Socrates sometimes described himself as a midwife, helping others to give birth to the truths that are already within. When you read the Crito, that's our seminar reading, look for how Socrates uses the Socratic method with Crito, leading him through a journey of discovery by a series of questions. For this reason, the dialogues about Socrates cannot be read in pieces like the aphorisms of Heraclitus, but need to be read all the way through as one whole conversation. Socrates is credited with laying the foundations of Western thought, although I would include the Mediterranean philosophers in this, and like Malcolm X, point out that this foundation cannot be limited to Europe. Here are a few of the key ideas Socrates, through his friend and student Plato, gave us, in addition to the conviction about a priori knowledge. The concept of rational argument, also called dialectic. The importance of ideas over material things. The importance of virtue, or moral goodness, over pleasures. Reason, that is using your head, over emotions, that's using your heart, or your stomach, or other parts of the body. The concept that knowledge is virtue. In other words, if people know what is right, they do it. People who are choosing to do wrong or evil things are simply misguided. They think that what they are doing is right. It's a generous view of human nature. Know yourself, in Greek, gnodi se auton, or the unexamined life is not worth living, meaning to live reflectively, constantly to examine your own feelings, thoughts, relationships, and choices, and to ask yourself, are you acting in accord with moral principles? And finally, the importance of justice in society, which Socrates talks about at length in the well-known dialogue, The Republic. This 18th century painting by Jean-Baptiste Regnault illustrates some of these convictions. Socrates' young friend Alcibiades, that's the guy in the middle with red hair, has been enjoying some physical pleasures. In a bed, with not just one but 3 women, a jar of wine, and a plate of food handy there on the floor. Might translate into beer and pizza in today's world. Clearly he's in a high-class place. The covers on the bed, the draperies, the columns, the ancient Greek equivalent of a luxury hotel. He is living the life. Socrates bursts into the room and grabs Alcibiades by the arm and is dragging him away from all this, while a woman in the sheets cling to him. Where to? Socrates' arm points upward to where we can glimpse an open sky. The light and space of outdoors contrast with the dark confines of the bed. It is a symbol of the freedom of letting go of physical pleasures and looking for happiness in higher things, moral virtue, ideas, working for justice in your society, making the world a better place. Plato's famous allegory of the cave, which you've probably read, has a similar message. It's a story about some strange prisoners chained in a cave since birth, and Socrates is telling the story. The prisoners are forced to stare at a shadow play on the back wall of the cave, until one of them gets out and goes outside and realizes that there's a whole nother world out there and that that's what's really real. The story can have many layers of interpretation. For Plato, it means that the visible, tangible things that we can see and touch are not what is most real. They're just shadows. What is most real are ideal truths, mathematical truths, scientific truths, but also moral principles such as honesty, goodness, respect for life, and love. These truths are universal, true for everyone, no matter your personal experience, culture, or social context. That's a daring claim in today's world, where most people are fixated on, you do you and I'll do me. You have your truth, I have mine, and you don't have the right to force your truth on me, as well as on the recognition of different perspectives among diverse cultures. To go back to Socrates' story, going around Athens and making fools out of respected people eventually got him in trouble. He ticked off the wrong people and was arrested on charges of impiety, which means disrespecting the gods, a serious crime in ancient Greece, and of corrupting the youth. He was tried by a jury of Athenian citizens, choosing to represent himself instead of getting a lawyer, and he was found guilty. He was sentenced to death, execution by drinking a poison called hemlock, the ancient world's version of lethal injection. It was Plato, one of Socrates' young friends and disciples, who preserved the memory of Socrates and his teachings in writings called dialogues. The dialogues portray Socrates in conversation with various people. Scholars debate how much of the dialogues represent what Socrates actually said, and how much represents the ideas of Plato. Most likely a combination of both. Our seminar reading is one of these dialogues called Crito, after the person with whom Socrates is talking. The dialogue takes place when Socrates was in prison, awaiting his execution. The execution has been postponed because of a religious holy season taking place at that time, but will happen when a certain ship returns from a religious pilgrimage. Crito comes to see Socrates, and he and his friends have a plan for busting Socrates out of prison and smuggling him away to another city where he will be welcomed. In the conversation that ensues, Crito tries to persuade Socrates to escape. We first hear Crito giving a long litany of arguments on pages 4 and 5. Socrates then weighs the reasons for and against this path, engaging Crito in conversation and eventually coming to a decision. As always, read this dialogue slowly, hearing the words in your mind, or if possible, out loud. Take it a few sentences at a time, look up unfamiliar words and write their definitions in the margins of your reading. Then write paraphrases or summaries in your own words of what is being said. Separate out the various arguments made by Crito and Socrates, and decide for yourself whom you agree with, or have some other view, and why. If you were in the dialogue, what would you say to either of them? I would like to point out a few key places in the reading whose meaning might seem a bit obscure on first read, but which tie into some of Socrates' key convictions. And remember, if you didn't pick up a paper copy of the reading in class, you can find it in Blackboard under Seminar Readings. At the top of page 6, Socrates first responds to Crito's long list of arguments. Dear Crito, your zeal is invaluable if a right one, but if wrong, the greater the zeal, the greater the evil. Look up that word, zeal, and consider carefully what Socrates is saying here. Just because you feel a lot of zeal for something does not make it right. Try to think of some examples. The following several pages, 7 and 8, are a true Socratic dialogue where Socrates leads Crito through a train of reasoning to get him to see the problem with one of his arguments. Note Socrates' use of an analogy that many people can relate to, namely, the analogy of a trainer or coach. What is Socrates trying to say here, and can you relate it to your personal experiences? On page 8, as Socrates continues this argument, he uses the word principle in a way which may seem kind of obscure. Recall that we encountered this key term, principle or arche in Greek, when we studied the Mediterranean philosophers. Socrates now uses the same word to refer to a, quote, higher part of the human person, end quote, a part which can be improved by justice, but injured by injustice. Without explicitly saying so, Socrates seems to mean the soul. When you read, consider this, and consider whether you agree or disagree with Socrates on the existence of such a thing, and on the claim he is making about it. On page 11, Socrates again uses the word principle, this time to refer to a moral value which he is explaining to Crito. Tell me then whether you agree with and assent to my first principle, that neither injury, nor retaliation, nor warding off evil by evil is ever right, and I apologize for the typos in the slide here. And shall that be the premise of our agreement? Principle here has the sense that I gave it in the first few slides of this lecture on moral reasoning. That is, a principle is a value or rule that you hold to be true, which has implications for the choices you make. It cannot be proven. It is an assumption or belief. But for Socrates, the most basic and universal moral principles are written into the very fabric of all of our souls before we are born. They do not need to be proven, only recognized. In the closing pages of this dialogue, it is important to notice new characters enter. They are figments of Socrates' imagination. At the bottom of page 11, Socrates asks Crito to imagine what the laws of Athens would say to him if they could talk. The tables are then turned, and it is the laws who are questioning Socrates, giving him a taste of his own medicine. I like to picture a bunch of personified scrolls glaring at Socrates with their hands on their hips, giving him a talking to. Just be aware of this shift in the dialogue when you get to those pages, and see whether you agree or disagree with Socrates' views on how we relate to our country and our government. As always, annotate the whole reading closely, with summaries, definitions, and responses. The reading, the handout that you turn in, should look like you spent an hour and a half with it, not like you breezed through it in 15 minutes. Write neatly. Do your usual Blackboard posts, as described in the syllabus, on at least 2 different days by 7 p.m. on the evening before your seminar. You can earn extra credit, as long as the posts are well written, by doing them on 3 different days. So far, we are still keeping to the schedule in the syllabus. Contact me if you have questions, and I look forward to seeing you in seminar. Now, write a closing journal entry. Summarize what you've picked up about Socrates from this lecture, in your own words, but using information that I've talked about. Focus on what is most interesting or memorable to you, but be accurate. Write at least 7 to 10 complete and meaningful sentences. Once again, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in seminar.